This is Nicolas Maduro on a US warship. Hours earlier, he was shaking hands with China's top diplomat in Latin America. That handshake was Maduro's last official act as president. His strategic partner couldn't save him, couldn't even warn him. For 20 years, China poured over $60 billion into Venezuela, the world's largest oil reserves handed to them on a platter. They thought they were playing chess. But the US wasn't playing chess. They changed the game to poker, and they controlled the cards, the chips, and the rules. How do you legally steal $100 billion? We found the cheat codes. And here's the thing, they work on any country. Look, you've probably heard about Venezuela, the economic collapse, the hyperinflation, Maduro's arrest. But what you haven't heard is how the US actually pulled this off. Because this isn't a story about a failed socialist economy. It's not even about oil. This is a story about the hidden weapons in global finance. The executive orders that freeze assets across borders. The court rulings that let creditors seize a country's crown jewels. The banking system that can cut anyone off from the global economy with a single designation. China spent 2 decades building what they thought was an airtight position. The largest bilateral lending relationship in history, strategic partnerships at the highest level, and the US deleted it with paperwork. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how they did it. The legal mechanisms, the double standards, the moment China realized their all-weather partnership was worth exactly 1 press release. Now, here's what most people get wrong about Venezuela. They think this was a collapse, a natural consequence of corruption and mismanagement. And sure, Venezuela was spectacularly corrupt. We're talking $300 billion stolen. But corruption doesn't explain why China's investments got frozen while Chevron got a license to pump. Corruption doesn't explain why Russia got sanctioned out while American companies got sanctioned in. See, what happened to China in Venezuela wasn't an accident. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept for a new kind of economic warfare. The US didn't compete with China for Venezuela's oil. They didn't negotiate. They didn't compromise. They just changed the rules. And then they enforced the new rules on everyone except themselves. Welcome to the rules-based international order. To understand how the greatest heist in geopolitical history went down, we need to go back to 2007, to a moment when China made what looked like the smartest investment on Earth. In the next 25 minutes, we're going to trace exactly how this unraveled. We'll start with the logic, why China's loans for oil model seemed absolutely foolproof, why Beijing was willing to pour more money into Venezuela than any other country in history. Then, we'll look at the fatal flaws, the 3 things nobody wanted to talk about: the man dependency, the math problem, and the corruption iceberg that was hiding beneath the surface. But here's where it gets interesting. When Venezuela collapsed, China thought they'd just renegotiate, restructure the debt, wait it out. What they didn't realize was that the Americans had been preparing a different kind of toolkit: executive orders that declared Venezuela a national security threat, sanctions that made it illegal to touch Venezuelan assets, court rulings that turned a state oil company into a piggy bank for American creditors. And the kill mechanism, the one that China still doesn't have an answer for: secondary sanctions. The ability to tell any bank in the world, deal with Venezuela, and you lose access to the dollar. We'll look at the double standard, how Rosneft got sanctioned out while Chevron got licensed in. Same oil field, different flags, different treatment. And then we'll get to January 2026, the night when China's special envoy finished dinner with Maduro, toasting their all-weather strategic partnership. 4 hours later, American helicopters were overhead, and Beijing's response was a strongly worded press release. But this isn't just history, because the playbook that worked on Venezuela, it works on any country that holds assets in American jurisdiction, any bank that processes dollar transactions, any leader who thinks a Chinese partnership protects them from American power. The game didn't end in Caracas, it just got started. So let's go back to the beginning. Back to when lending Venezuela billions seemed like stealing candy from a baby. The year is 2007. China is growing at 10% a year. Factories running around the clock. Cities expanding faster than anyone can map them. And they have one massive problem. 60% of their oil imports come from the Middle East, and every single barrel has to pass through shipping lanes controlled by the United States Navy. Now imagine you're sitting in Beijing, planning for the next 50 years. You know your economy runs on oil. You know America controls the routes. And you're watching the US invade Iraq, station fleets in the Persian Gulf, build bases across the Pacific. What do? You find an alternative. And in 2007, that alternative had a name: Venezuela. 303 billion barrels, the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, sitting in America's backyard, run by a government that would sell to literally anyone except America. And here's what made it seem so brilliant. China didn't want to buy Venezuelan oil on the open market. They wanted to own the supply chain. So they invented something called loans for oil. Think of it like a barter system between countries. Step 1. China Development Bank deposits money into a special account controlled by Venezuela's development bank, Bandes. Step 2. Venezuela uses that money however they want. Infrastructure, government programs, whatever. Step 3. Instead of paying back cash, Venezuela ships oil to China Oil, a Chinese state company. Step 4. China Oil sells that oil and deposits the proceeds back into the CDB account. The dollars never leave the loop. No Western banks, no SWIFT transfers, no American oversight. It's like having a private economy that exists outside the global financial system. Between 2007 and 2015, Chinese policy banks poured $62 billion into Venezuela, the largest bilateral lending relationship of the 21st century, larger than anything in Africa, larger than the rest of Latin America combined. From Beijing's perspective, this was genius. They were building an energy supply line that the US couldn't touch. What could possibly go wrong? To understand why China was so confident, you need to understand the man who sold them this dream. Hugo Chavez wasn't just Venezuela's president, he was a true believer. A charismatic revolutionary who saw himself as the heir to Simón Bolívar and the nemesis of American imperialism. He once declared, and I quote, "The Bolivarian Revolution is rooted in the ideology of Mao Zedong." Now, whether he actually believed that is debatable. What's not debatable is that he meant it as a signal. To Beijing, Chavez was saying, "I'm your guy. I'll take your money. I'll send you oil. And I'll never, ever align with Washington." And China bought in completely. They didn't just lend money, they built infrastructure, roads, railways, housing. They even helped build Venezuela's surveillance state. ZTE provided the technology for the Fatherland card system, tracking citizens' movements and purchases. China was all in on Chavez's Venezuela. There was just one problem. The entire relationship was built around one man, his charisma, his control, his willingness to keep the oil flowing no matter what. And in 2013, Hugo Chavez died. But the rot had started long before Chavez stopped breathing. See, there were 3 fatal flaws baked into this perfect investment, and everyone involved knew about them. They just didn't want to talk about it. Flaw number 1. The entire partnership depended on Chavez's personal authority. The loans, the contracts, the political cover, all of it ran through one man. When he died, there was no institutional framework to keep the machine running. Flaw number 2. The math never actually worked. At peak commitment, Venezuela owed China 330,000 barrels of oil per day just for debt service. That's 1/3 of their total production, just to pay interest on the loans. Let that sink in. 1/3 of everything they pumped went straight to Beijing before Venezuela saw a single dollar. And flaw number 3, the corruption iceberg. China wasn't lending to a government, they were lending to a criminal enterprise. Former Planning Minister Jorge Giordani, a Chavez loyalist, later admitted that $300 billion was stolen across Venezuelan government ministries during the boom years. 300 billion. That's nearly 5 times what China lent. That's roughly the entire GDP of Portugal. Stolen. The money wasn't building infrastructure, it was building offshore bank accounts. In 2013, Chavez died. A year later, oil crashed from $100 a barrel to $40. And suddenly, the perfect investment revealed itself as the biggest trap in financial history. What happened next wasn't a recession, it was a demolition. Oil production, 3 million barrels a day at its peak. By 2020, 350,000, an 89% collapse. GDP, down 75% between 2014 and 2021. 3/4 of the economy, gone. Inflation, 130,000% in 2018. People needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy groceries. And the brain drain was catastrophic. Remember Chavez's 2003 purge of PDVSA, when he fired 19,000 employees for opposing him? That gutted the company's institutional knowledge. The R&D division, Intervep, lost 80% of its workforce. By the time the crisis hit, Venezuela didn't just lack money. They lacked the engineers who knew how to pump the oil. And here's where it gets absurd. Venezuela now produced less oil in total than they owed China for debt service. They literally couldn't pump enough crude to pay their bills. The collateral that was supposed to guarantee China's loans? It was trapped underground, behind broken equipment, managed by political appointees with zero technical expertise. So what does China do? Option 1, write off the debt. Take the loss, move on. But that sets a terrible precedent. By 2020, 60% of China's overseas lending was going to countries in financial distress. If they forgive Venezuela, everyone else lines up for the same treatment. The entire Belt and Road model collapses. Option 2, demand payment. From what? The oil can't flow. The infrastructure is collapsing. You can't squeeze blood from a stone. Option 3, intervene militarily. Except China's entire international brand is built on non-interference in domestic affairs. They can't start acting like America without destroying their reputation across the developing world. China was trapped, and they didn't even know the worst part yet. Matt Furchin from the US Institute of Peace put it perfectly. China created a lender's trap for itself. Lending to a poorly managed and increasingly corrupt economy means the prospects of being repaid are increasingly slim. While China was trying to renegotiate, a different group of players saw opportunity. The Vultures. ConocoPhillips, Crystalex, a dozen other companies that had been burned by Venezuela's nationalizations over the years. They'd been fighting in international courts, winning judgments, and waiting for their moment. In 2016, Crystalex, a Canadian gold mining company, won a $1.2 billion arbitration award for a mine Venezuela had seized. In 2019, ConocoPhillips won $8.7 billion, the largest international arbitration award in history. But winning a judgment is one thing, collecting is another. Venezuela had no money. Their assets were all in Venezuela, where courts couldn't touch them. Except for one thing, CITGO. 3 refineries on American soil, a pipeline network, 4,000 gas stations, Venezuela's crown jewel in the United States, worth somewhere between $11 and $13 billion. And in August 2018, an American court found the key. The judge ruled that PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, was the alter ego of the Venezuelan government, legally the same entity, which meant creditors with judgments against Venezuela could now go after PDVSA's assets, including CITGO. One legal ruling turned Venezuela's crown jewel into a liquidation sale. While China was playing defense, the Americans went to court, and they found a weapon more powerful than any sanction. If you're enjoying this cheerful breakdown of economic collapse, do me a favor and destroy that like button. Now, let's look at how America actually pulled this off. What I'm about to show you is the playbook, the actual legal architecture that let the United States delete China's position in Venezuela. 4 executive orders, 5 years, a complete transformation of who owned what. March 2015, Obama signs Executive Order 13692. For the first time, Venezuela is officially declared an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. Now, was Venezuela actually threatening to invade Florida? Obviously not. But that language, national security threat, unlocks an entire toolkit of economic weapons. August 2017, Trump signs 13808. This one bans U.S. persons from transactions involving new Venezuelan debt. Translation: Venezuela can't refinance. They can't access American capital markets. The financial oxygen gets cut off. January 2019, the hammer drops. Executive Order 13850 designates PDVSA, the entire state oil company, as a sanctioned entity. Every asset PDVSA owns in U.S. jurisdiction is now frozen, including CITGO. And August 2019, 13884, full economic embargo. Every single Venezuelan government asset in the United States is blocked. But here's what made this truly devastating. Any transaction with a U.S. nexus, processed through American banks, denominated in dollars, involving any American person anywhere in the chain, was now illegal. Venezuela didn't just lose access to American markets, they lost access to the dollar. Now you might think, okay, so Venezuela can't use American banks, they'll just use someone else's banks, right? Wrong. This is where secondary sanctions come in. And this is the part China still doesn't have an answer for. Imagine you run a small business, and the biggest company in town, let's call them Dollar Corp, controls the only highway everyone uses for shipping. One day, Dollar Corp says, "We don't like that factory across town. If you do any business with them, you can never use our highway again." Now, that factory isn't your enemy, but if you can't use the highway, your business dies. So what do? You stop dealing with the factory. That's secondary sanctions. The highway is the US dollar system. Every day, about $5 trillion in transactions flow through American financial infrastructure. If you're a bank, Chinese, European, doesn't matter. You need access to that system to function. So when the US sanctions Venezuela, they're not just saying Americans can't deal with Venezuela. They're saying any bank, anywhere in the world, that helps Venezuela access the financial system gets cut off from the dollar. Chinese banks faced a choice. Option A: keep processing Venezuelan transactions, lose access to American markets, dollar clearing, and every client who needs US financial services. Option B: cut Venezuela off. Keep your global business intact. Every major Chinese bank chose option B. March 2019, the US sanctioned Bandes, Venezuela's development bank, the primary conduit for Chinese loan disbursements. Treasury's own assessment said this made it difficult for Venezuela to restructure its $20 billion debt with China. Difficult. That's diplomatic language for impossible. For a century, the US military was the ultimate weapon of American power. Aircraft carriers, bases around the world, the ability to project force anywhere. In the 21st century, there's a new weapon, and it's even more powerful. The US doesn't need to invade anymore. They just make your money radioactive. China just learned they don't have a counter. So what happened to CITGO? Remember those creditors we talked about? ConocoPhillips, Crystalex. They'd been waiting for years with their court judgments. November 2025. A federal judge approves the sale of CITGO to Amber Energy, a subsidiary of Elliott Investment Management, the same Elliott Management famous for buying distressed assets and making billions. The price? $7.3 billion for an asset valued at 11 to 13 billion. Venezuela called it the theft of the century. And who gets paid from that sale? ConocoPhillips, Crystalex, Rusoro. American and Canadian companies with arbitration awards. You know who's not in that line? China. They never got a court judgment. They never filed arbitration. They thought they had a strategic partnership that would protect them. It didn't. Now you might be thinking, okay, but these rules apply to everyone, right? Sanctions are sanctions. Courts are courts. The law is the law. That's what China thought too. Let me show you what actually happened. Let's talk about Russia for a minute. By 2019, Russia's Rosneft had invested $6.5 billion in Venezuela. Loans, advance payments, infrastructure. And here's the key. By late 2019, Rosneft was handling 70 to 80% of Venezuela's oil exports. They were making roughly $120 million a month buying Venezuelan crude at a discount and reselling it on global markets. The sanctions were supposed to isolate Venezuela, and Rosneft had found a way around them. So what did the US do? February 2020, OFAC designates Rosneft Trading SA, a Swiss subsidiary, as a sanctioned entity. March 2020, they designate another subsidiary, TNK Trading International. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin's statement: Rosneft Trading is the primary broker of global deals for the sale and transport of Venezuela's crude oil. Within weeks, literally weeks, Rosneft announced total withdrawal from Venezuela. They sold every asset to a Russian government entity in exchange for shares in themselves. The sanctions worked. Russia was out. Now let's look at how America treated America. November 2022. OFAC issues General License 41. This license authorizes Chevron, an American company, to resume oil production in Venezuela, to lift crude, to export it, to sell it on international markets. Same country, same oil fields, same sanctions regime. Rosneft, designated and forced out. Chevron, licensed and welcomed back in. And here's the detail that tells you everything. General License 41 explicitly prohibits Chevron from doing business with entities owned or controlled by the Russian Federation. The license doesn't just allow Chevron to operate, it specifically excludes Russian participation. Russia, sanctioned out. China, frozen out. America's Chevron, licensed in. The rules-based international order has exactly one rule. It's American. And what about China? CNPC stopped directly lifting Venezuelan oil after the 2019 sanctions. They were never offered a license like Chevron's. Instead, Chinese companies tried workarounds, shadow fleets, transshipment through Malaysia and Singapore, oil mislabeled as bitumen mix to avoid detection. December 2025, OFAC designates 4 Chinese shipping companies for Venezuela oil trade: Ares Global Investment, Corniola Limited, Crepe Myrtle, Winky International. First time Chinese firms were directly targeted under Venezuela sanctions. A Morgan Lewis legal analysis put it bluntly: the United States will not authorize the production of oil in Venezuela unless Venezuela severs economic ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba, and agrees to partner exclusively with the United States. Exclusively with the United States. That's not sanctions enforcement, that's market capture. All those executive orders, all those court rulings, the double standards, they were just the setup. What happened next proved that none of China's partnerships meant anything when American helicopters are in the air. January 3rd, 2026, 8 p.m. Caracas time. Nicolas Maduro sits down for dinner with Qiu Xiaoqi, China's special envoy for Latin American affairs, the highest-ranking Chinese diplomat in the region. This isn't a routine meeting. Qiu is there to demonstrate something. In 2023, China had upgraded Venezuela to all-weather strategic partnership, the highest diplomatic designation Beijing can give. All-weather, meaning we stand with you in sunshine and in storms. Maduro and Qiu toast to the partnership, to 20 years of cooperation, to a future where Chinese investment would rebuild Venezuela's shattered economy. That dinner was Maduro's last official act as president. 4 hours later, American helicopters would be overhead. 11:46 p.m. Eastern Time. President Trump gives the green light for Operation Absolute Resolve. Within minutes, over 150 aircraft launch from 20 bases across the Western Hemisphere. 2:01 a.m. Caracas time. Delta Force helicopters touch down at Fort Tuna, Venezuela's main military installation in the capital. The assault teams move fast. Maduro and his wife are attempting to reach a steel safe room when they're intercepted. By 4:29 a.m., Nicolas Maduro is on the deck of the USS Iwo Jima, blindfolded, in a grey Nike sweatsuit. Total operation time, 2.5 hours. The Cuban military advisors present at Fort Tuna fought back. 32 were killed. Venezuelan casualties topped 100. American injuries? 7. None fatal. This wasn't a surgical strike. This was a full military operation. The UN Secretary-General would later call it a dangerous precedent. But by then, it was done. Now remember Chiu Shaoqi, China's special envoy, the man who had dinner with Maduro hours earlier? He was still in Caracas when the helicopters came. China's highest-ranking diplomat in Latin America, in country specifically to demonstrate the all-weather strategic partnership, was trapped in a city under American military control. He couldn't leave. He couldn't intervene. He couldn't even get a message to Beijing fast enough to matter. China's official response? Deeply shocked. Strongly condemns. That's it. A press release. 20 years of partnership. $60 billion in loans. The highest diplomatic designation China can offer. And when the helicopters came, Beijing issued a statement. The all-weather strategic partnership turned out to be worth exactly one press release. All-weather means all-weather except American helicopters. China spent 2 decades building what they thought was a strategic position in America's backyard. An oil supply outside US control. A partner who would never bend to Washington. And in 2.5 hours, American special forces proved that none of it meant anything. So let's tally the score. 20 years and $100 billion later. Who actually won? China's side of the ledger. $60 billion in direct loans. The largest bilateral lending relationship of the 21st century. 10 to 20 billion still outstanding and likely unrecoverable. The new Venezuelan government could invoke odious debt doctrine and refuse to pay a single cent. Control of oil supply? Gone. Not because America took it, because Venezuela's production collapsed to 1/10 of what it was. The collateral was always underground. The leverage was always in Washington. Diplomatic prestige? Humiliated. Their all-weather strategic partner was captured on their envoy's watch. The highest designation Beijing offers bought them a press release. And here's where it gets truly absurd. Right now, today, Chinese officials are seeking talks with both Venezuela and the United States to get assurances about their loans. China spent $100 billion trying to build an oil supply outside American control. Now they're asking America if they can keep any of it. America's side of the ledger. CITGO, 3 refineries, pipelines, thousands of gas stations sold to American investors. Amber Energy, backed by Elliott Management. The Vulture fund that specializes in buying distressed assets. The Venezuelan oil sector, now operating under US-managed accounts. All proceeds from oil sales flow through American financial infrastructure. Chevron, licensed to pump. The only major oil company with authorization to operate in Venezuela. China's Belt and Road credibility? Damaged globally. If Beijing can't protect their biggest investment, what does that mean for smaller countries taking Chinese loans? President Trump put it simply, we're going to run the country. He wasn't being subtle. But let's be honest about who actually paid the price here. The Venezuelan people. 7 million refugees. The largest displacement crisis in the Western Hemisphere. An economy reduced to rubble. A generation that will never recover what they lost. The small Chinese refineries, the teapots, that depended on cheap Venezuelan crude. Collateral damage in a game they weren't even playing. International law itself. The UN called this operation a dangerous precedent, because if America can capture a head of state, seize a nation's assets, and install its own companies without declaring war, without Security Council approval, without any international oversight, then who's next? This story isn't really about Venezuela, or China, or even oil. It's about what happens when one country controls the infrastructure of global commerce. Who should be paying attention right now? Every Belt and Road recipient nation. If you've taken Chinese loans for infrastructure, ports, railways, power plants, and you think Beijing will protect you from American pressure, look at what happened to their biggest investment. Any country with assets in US jurisdiction, real estate in New York, bank accounts at Citigroup, treasury bonds in reserve portfolios, all of it is one executive order away from frozen. Any bank, anywhere in the world, that processes dollar transactions. You're not independent. You're operating under American license, whether you realize it or not. The US just demonstrated it can seize a country's assets, capture its leader, and install its own oil companies, using nothing but sanctions, court rulings, and special forces. No declaration of war, no UN approval, just power.
And what did China learn?
Look at the numbers. In 2016, Chinese overseas lending peaked at $50 billion a year. Belt and Road was going to reshape the world. Today, flatlined at $7 billion, an 85% collapse. 60% of China's existing overseas lending portfolio is now held by countries in financial distress, countries that can't pay, countries that might invoke odious debt, countries that might just switch sides. Beijing has shifted from bold investor to nervous debt collector. They're not building new partnerships, they're trying to salvage the old ones. China learned something in Venezuela that their strategists never wanted to admit. International law protects you, until someone with more power decides it doesn't. In the great game of global finance, it's not about who has the money, it's not even about who has the oil, it's about who controls the rules. And for the last 50 years, all the rules have been written in one language, the US dollar. China thought they could play outside that system, build their own pipelines, create their own financial architecture, find partners America couldn't touch. Venezuela thought they'd found a patron who couldn't be sanctioned, a superpower that would stand with them against Washington. They were both wrong. The $106 billion isn't gone, it was transferred, from Beijing's balance sheet to Washington's leverage. Next time you fill up at a CITGO station, remember what you're looking at. It's not just a gas station, it's the trophy of a heist that took 20 years to complete. Now I want to hear from you. Here's the question. Do you think China will ever build a financial system that can challenge the dollar? Or is this, what we just watched, the permanent shape of global finance? Drop your answer in the comments. Dollar dominance forever, or China eventually breaks through? I read every comment, and this one's going to spark some interesting debates. If this is your first time here, this is what we do. We break down the hidden mechanics of money and power, the stuff that actually determines who wins and who loses in the global economy. No cheerleading, no ideology, just the ledgers. If that sounds useful, hit subscribe. Because this playbook we just analyzed, it's not retired, it's being refined. And when it gets used again, and it will, you'll want to understand how it works before it shows up in the headlines.